Welcome, everybody, to the Brown Bag Lunch for today. I am so excited. We are so excited at the Gender Equity Initiative to bring in one of our fellow colleagues, Kiley Samz. Kiley Samz holds a bachelor degree in history, classical studies from Duke University, and a master's in medieval and Renaissance studies from Fordham University. She is now an American antiquarian bookseller working at Rutenberg Rare Booksellers in Los Angeles, although she's in North Carolina. So Kiley is going to the heading of her talk today. I'm very excited about it. I can't wait. Bibliotheque Bleue and the Fervor of the Occult in 19th century France. Ooh, I am so excited, Kiley. Yay. Welcome.
I hope I didn't overspeak with that title, but I'm going to do my best to get there. But first of all, everyone needs to see my dog. His name is Joseph Moxon, after the printer. All right, I can't fail now.
Okay, no failing. And it's so great. I'm so excited. This is exciting. Go ahead, go for it.
Okay, well, so an area of speciality.
Oh, wait, before you start, I'm going to say to people, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. And maybe even we can do a little chat afterwards, depending on how much time we have. But yeah, so we will do that afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, so one of my areas of speciality is in books on the occult and witchcraft. And I'm sure everyone present knows about grimoires. Grimoires are basically spell books, early modern to modern books on how to practice witchcraft. And we're going to look at some cool ones today that are already sold, unfortunately. But in order to talk about witchcraft in France in the early modern era, we have to start out with the affair of the poisons. So in the late 17th century, actually 1677 to be specific, there was this major international or major national conspiracy about witchcraft and poisoning. Basically, a bunch of really high-ranking French members of the nobility died under suspicious circumstances. And rumors started to circulate that they had been poisoned or cursed. And people who, were in the upper echelon of society, but maybe didn't have the best reputations, started to come under accusation that they had poisoned these members of the nobility in order to get one up in society. It was often like someone's uncle passed away and they stood to inherit a title or fortune. So these people who were accused in the rumors, most of them were women, as one would expect when dealing with witchcraft conspiracy. And several of them came under a tribunal in Paris and were tortured until they confessed to witchcraft and implicated others. Obviously, we know that false confessions have been a huge problem throughout the history of witchcraft. And in particular, this really implicated a lot of high-ranking women, wives of the nobility. Well, the king at the time, Louis XIV, got really paranoid because people who, typically were protected were dying under suspicious circumstances. So he feared for his own life. And he had his authorities round up 36 people total and execute them for practicing magic. And this ordeal was a massive headache for the French authorities. As you can imagine, having wealthy, high-ranking individuals be questioned and arrested and executed, it had a lot of reverberating effects throughout society. And after this happened, after they executed the 36 people and everyone was really mad about it, they sort of turned a blind eye to evidence or rumors of witchcraft and occult practice in France. And it didn't die down, the rumors, but the French authorities weren't really trying to get involved in another affair of the poisons, because they didn't want to incite more hysteria. On the other hand, the French people had heard these stories of people who were able to poison their uncles or fathers and come into wealth and prosperity. And they were intrigued. And this was also sort of around the time that the French populace was really struggling with poverty. The king was massively overspending, lots of disease, plague outbreaks, governmental overreach. They were cooling on religion and religiosity, and getting pretty nihilistic at the time. So a lot of people turned to studying the occult in the hopes of chasing wealth and health. Now, so that's the late 17th century. In the beginning to mid 18th century, we start seeing a lot of literacy improvement in France. People are able to read, and they're in the market for cheap books because books were still pretty expensive. Enter Bibliotheque Bleue. Bibliotheque Bleue is it's a modern term for these cheap, simply formatted chapbooks that were printed en masse, very crudely, and they typically weren't even bound. They would be stabbed or just folded. And they were always in the vernacular, and they were really affordable, just pennies. So they became widely available to the people. And in this era of interest in the occult, a lot of those books ended up being grimoires. You see other things in the Bibliotheque Bleue. You see saints' lives, sometimes like romances, little sort of theatrical novellas, but grimoires and witchcraft books were a big portion of the Bibliotheque Bleue. They were sold primarily by what we call colporteurs, who were sort of nomadic, traveling salesmen. They were often immigrants, and they would lean into being foreign, to being nomadic, to being traveling. It sort of gave them an air of mystery, and they would like tell fake, even if they were French, they would tell tales of their homeland and their travels and all of the, sorcerers and witches that they had met on their travels, and they would sell these little grimoires to people. It made it really hard because obviously the French church, the church and the French government weren't thrilled about there being witchcraft spell books disseminated across France, but it was pretty hard to nail down where they were coming from when they were being sold primarily by people who didn't have an address. So, and these people would often, they would sell the books. They would also sell like herbs and teas that went along with the grimoires and had, love spells, things like that. In the beginning of the 18th century, the three major cities where the Bibliotheque Bleue books were being produced were Troyes, Rouen, and Paris. But into the 18th century and 19th century, printing houses became a lot more prolific, and the Bibliotheque Bleue tended to flourish in smaller areas of printing production, because first of all, they were far away from censorship, but also because they were able to get these books into major cities without having to print them there and paying the cost of being in a major city. Even if people were illiterate, these books became sort of talismans. The grimoires, we'll talk about it in a little while, but There's a tradition of carrying a grimoire as a safeguard against illness and violence, but this would also serve the same purpose in like a saint's life. You would carry the saint's life of your patron saint to protect you. Now, the Bibliotheque Bleue books that we see most often today that are sort of still extant in the market and in libraries were mostly printed by a bookseller printer named Simon Blocquel. His printing house was set up in Lille. He was an orphan. He was raised by his aunt and uncle. His uncle owned a print shop and trained him up. He was an apprentice and he inherited the outfit. Lille in particular is really well situated as a place to print witchcraft books. It's right on the border of Germany. It has a port. It's in the very north, or not Germany, sorry, Belgium. It's in the very northeast corner of France. So not a lot of activity coming from Paris up there. You can easily export these books. It's sort of an intersection internationally and by water. So he did really well, and his books pretty much always either duodecimo or 16mos, cheap paper, but they stood the test of time. He started out selling like popular prints and popular culture romances and things like that. And his business model was more quantity over quality, and which so was most of Bibliotheque Bleue, and that was what made the books available to everyone rather than just the wealthy. And around that time that he was like furiously printing grimoires, France was sort of becoming a hotbed of spirituality. We're talking now into the mid 19th century. He was active, his birth and death 1780 to 1863. He was a pretty old guy when he died, but he was really active like 1810 to 1850. We see most of his books being printed. Now saying that date, 1810 to 1850, is it's difficult to nail down because grimoires were normally published under bogus imprints, as we'll see with a few of the ones I'm going to show you. They would be printed under the imprint of like Memphis in Egypt, or with a date of 1521, even though it's clearly 19th century paper, 19th century printing. So it is hard to nail down printing information for Blocquel's books, but watermark evidence and typography indicate early to mid 19th century. Now, when this was happening, this is post French Revolution. There's a lot of mistrust in French society for the church and for municipal authorities. And France was sort of a haven for a lot of people who wanted to dabble in hypnotism, animal magnetism, clairvoyance, that kind of thing. For example, Franz Mesmer, he got ousted from Vienna for his controversial experiments in animal magnetism, and he went to Paris, and he settled in Paris and started conducting his hypnotism and animal magnetism experiments very publicly. Public hypnosis sessions became very fashionable in France. They were sort of like the modern parlor games, and wealthy people would host a clinician to hypnotize someone in their home, and these were often women who were accused of being addled with hysteria. but the French society really sort of clung to that element of spirituality and dabbling in the spirit world and the supernatural. And obviously, I'm saying that France was a haven for these people. They did not look, the municipal and religious authorities weren't looking kindly on it, but the French people were really still, they were cognizant, and they were drawn to it, and those books were remaining on the shelves, which is why, you know, they're still extant today, when so many of the books that were placed on the index were burned or destroyed. The books that were being produced in France at this time were, we can still find them in the market. So let me shift to showing, I'm gonna share my screen here. I'm gonna show some, and, okay. So the first grimoire we're going to look at here is the Enchiridion Leonis Popeye. This is pretty much the most common grimoire that you'll see. I've had 3 copies with 3 different imprints, all Simon Blocquel, but this is a really widespread grimoire that you can find around. The legend of this grimoire states that it was given to Charlemagne the Great by Pope Leo III in the year 800. Obviously, that's a pretty unlikely story, but it is, it's a compilation of, this is probably the most Christianized grimoire, I guess we would say. It's a compilation of prayers, invocations, and psalms and rituals that are supposed to protect the reader, which, as I said before, the legend is that the Pope gave it to Charlemagne to protect him. The first printed edition of this text appeared in 1523, but it didn't really gain traction as a magic book. It was really more of a like Book of Hours at first, and sort of a religious talisman. It supposedly granted divine protection against all evils to whoever carried it and read it aloud. You had to read it aloud to receive the talismanic effect. The chapters also contain quotations from the Gospels, litanies of the saints, transcriptions of writings from Jerome and St. Augustine, as well as some prayers for conjuring spirits, spells for curing diseases, and ousting demons. So in the grimoire tradition, we often have books that we'll refer to as black magic. This wasn't a black magic book. Even though you see that it shows you how to use pentacles, it was very much couched in biblical tradition. Okay, the next one we're going to look at, the Red Dragon. This is anonymous. It was supposedly the author, the anonymous author, claims to have compiled it from King Solomon, from a manuscript of King Solomon. Sure. This is much darker. It includes instructions for making magical instruments and magic circles and how to use them. It has spells for summoning demons, and it has what I think is most interesting, it has a tabular hierarchy of demonic spirits, where they rank in the bureaucracy of hell and what their responsibilities are. It has directions for communicating with the dead, and a lot of incantations for daily use, for things like stopping a dog barking or fixing a broken marriage. this is one of my favorites. This is also interesting because the chapters that instruct you on how to invoke the powers of specific demons are signed or approved by that demon's signature. You'll see on the title here, it was approved by Astaroth, and that weird amalgamation of squiggles is supposedly the demon's signature saying that, yes, this is good to go. Okay. Next, the Grimoire of Pope Honorius. This is probably the most popular of the grimoires in the typical grimoire tradition. It was put on the index of banned books in 1800. This one is interesting because it was ostensibly designed to be used by a priest. It's the text is in the format of a mass. It was popular because it has the most information of any of the grimoires on treasure hunting and charms for healing the sick. It contains elements from other grimoires. All of these have a lot of overlap, and this is a book that was printed in few editions that we know of, but it did circulate a lot in manuscript on the European market and in many different languages. It was supposedly written by a 13th century pope, Pope Honorius, but it was likely forged sometime in the 16th century, which is when we see the first iteration of these texts pretty usually. And this one I think is interesting because this particular printing has a bibliography for further reading, further books on magical conjuring, all of which obviously were published by Simon Blocquel at his Lille shop. Okay. All right, this one, the True Black Magic. This is a really cool book. It's the most uncommon of Simon Blocquel's grimoires. It's really rare to find a copy of this. It's one of his earliest as well. The legend states that it was that it's a manuscript that was discovered in King Solomon's tomb, and it was transcribed and translated from the Hebrew by the mage Ero Greco. Sure, there's no substantive evidence to support that, but grain of salt. It contains a lot of instructions for making talismans and magic implements, which you can see in the plate in the middle of the slide. These are some of the things that you'll need to properly construct magic circles and pentacles and various altars. It contains instructions for becoming invisible, for flying, exorcism, and love spells. So pretty useful, wide range of topics there. And interestingly, it includes an entire chapter on hatred magic and how to inflict destruction and illness on one's enemies. Okay. Next, the last one we have is the Key of Solomon. This is a pretty well-known grimoire, supposedly attributed to King Solomon, but it was probably written between the 14th and 16th century. It contains instructions for summoning and controlling spirits and demons, and alchemical recipes. This is one of the few that actually addresses alchemy, which we often find intersecting with grimoires or with witchcraft in later texts. It has the final chapter teaches you how to capture green butterflies, which supposedly reveal the future and lead the master to buried treasure. It was a bestseller, and it's pretty easy to find copies of this book on the market today. And it was translated into basically every European language. The oldest extant manuscript of the Key of Solomon was written in Latin. And since it was so couched in treasure hunting, this is the grimoire that you sort of find the most editions, the most printings of across the European continent. However, it is also one of the most common titles that you'll find in court documents for convictions of witchcraft. They owned the Key of Solomon. Okay, well, that's what I've got. Lizzie, you're muted.
I was saying that's pretty magical. So if I'm going to wait for a couple of questions here, but before they come, I'm going to be the uneducated questionnaire here, because this is all new to me, which is really cool. So what does that word come from, grimoire? Do you know?
I don't know.
Because it's such a great word. It's like grim reaper.
It's a French word. It's a French word. I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. I probably should know.
Okay. So second question, since I don't know much about this, is what is animal magnetism?
Animal magnetism. So this was this idea that Mesmer had, that since he was piggybacking on the ideas of, or the Isaac Newton's theories on the earth being magnetized and the poles and the tides, and he theorized that humans and animals also have poles and magnetism in their bodies, and if you can harness that, you can control people's reactions to things, you can cure illnesses, you can make them do things you want them to do. I mean, I'm very much screwing it up, I'm sure, but it was this theory that if you harness the magnetism of another person, you can hypnotize them. That led to sort of the era of hypnosis and sort of diabolical spiritual intervention in human brains.
So yeah, they're kind of putting it on animals to make it more palatable.
Well, animal magnetism refers to humans too. It's just on living beings rather than
gotcha.
Rather than the earth.
I was like taking it verbatim right there. And so were the illustrations because of people who were illiterate? Like, do you think that was a thing, or?
I mean, I'm sure that there were people that were using the illustrations primarily because they were illiterate. I don't think that's the main reason. I mean, a lot of grimoire practice is very visual, making magic circles, making pentacles, and since you couldn't just like go out and buy the supplies to make a magic circle, you had to craft these things yourself. So that kind of material lends itself to illustration. And you see, I've had plenty of editions of these books, and the blocks are reused I mean, at least with Blocquel's production, he was reusing these really crude blocks. I mean, these you saw in the PowerPoint, like they're pretty crude woodcut blocks that he was using in like 1850. But it was quick and dirty dissemination of these texts. And if you've already got the blocks, why not use them?
Right. So what was so the price point, like the price point then and the price point now, like if somebody was interested then, what would it be costing them to pick up something like this? And then now, if somebody's really interested in this, what's the starter?
Yeah, so some of these books still have their original price on them. It's normally 3 pennies, sometimes even just 1 penny. I think the most I've seen is 3. So really cheap. Nowadays, they're actually, obviously, they're going to be higher in price. And it depends on how, I think Grimoire cataloging and Grimoire price setting is one of the, I think it's fun because it is so contingent upon cataloging and writing a good description of this stuff. The books that I showed you today, this cheapest one was $1,750 and the most expensive one was $4,500. So not 3 pennies, but there is a market at that price.
That's okay. So that's the starter person's gonna have to shell out a little bit to get their foot in the door of something like this. Got
Yeah,
it.
and it's if you're these were obviously they were cheaply produced, and they weren't typically, you could get deluxe versions of grimoires from a more from a higher quality printing house, and those are the ones that you'll find in really nice bindings. These are chapbooks, so they were ephemeral when they were made, and you'll never find one now in a contemporary binding. They've been rebound, so it's, while I say you can find these editions on the market, that's true to some extent, but it's hard to find them in good condition because someone, in shortly after the book was printed, had to take enough of an interest to put it in a good binding or to preserve it without it becoming.
Eminent domain rulings, it has to benefit town.
Roger, you're
What I would say is,
Roger,
all the
Roger,
buildings,
you're
but the historic.
there you go. Actually, have you seen a lot of, is there any type of forgery going on with this? I could see this kind of being something that would take to that.
I mean, these books were forged when they were printed. You can see the imprints are like Rome 1521 when it's clearly a 19th century book.
Okay.
And I mean, I haven't really looked for forgeries of these things in today's market, but I'm sure it could be done. And I mean, you can get editions of these texts that were, there was a resurgence in interest in grimoires and the occult in the 1970s, and a lot of these books have critical editions that were made in the 1970s.
Okay. One more question by me. I don't have any in the chat yet. So these nomadic people who were going around and selling these, was that including women, or was it generally, or was it not known? Like, was it men and women? Was it just men that were going door to door? It just seems when you said something about herbs and kind of the combo of selling a book and with the accoutrements, I was wondering, like, who was doing that, if we know.
I mean, I'm sure that there must have been women doing it. Most references to colporteurs have them being men, probably just by the virtue of they're the ones that are going to be able to travel more safely and hold money safely. But the references that I've seen in books and manuscripts from the period sort of indicate that they would even dye their skin to be darker so they looked more exotic, like as though they came from the Far East, or somewhere where the occult seemed possible.
That's super interesting thinking about that, like using that visual as a way to sell a book. That's
Yeah, sort
fascinating.
of to lean into being a roving salesperson, as though I've seen and met so many different walks of life, and I can tell you that this book it will preserve your health, or you know, and you also need this tea.
Right. Okay, my last question is, so did this spill over to the US, or did it take until like the turn of the century?
So, I don't do a lot of American imprints. I can say that spiritualism bled into the US in a pretty major way in the late 19th century, particularly in New England. There were people there were people who had entire churches of spirituality, and it wasn't distinctive from Christianity. It was a way to convene with the spirit world, which was supposedly divine. So there are a lot of books on spiritualism that are American imprints from the late 19th century. I don't know of American printed grimoires, but that's more just my own ignorance because I don't really do American books.
Oh, okay. I've got a couple of things here. Um, so Libby Wares, says most of the grimoires that I've seen, especially the Key of Solomon, have symbols that are meaningless to the average person. I had a thought that the spells were only for the initiated. Were these cheap copies written so that the average reader could perform the rituals, or the arcane signals only in the black magic books?
So yeah, so these were definitely blue collar, like run of the mill spells that everyone was supposed to be able to do. And if you read the text, they normally do explain what the symbols are. And often it is like the signature of a demon, or some sort of pentacle, and the text will explain it. But some in Simon Blocquel's books, you typically will see a transcription underneath, like, you know, the name of the demon transliterated into the Arabic alphabet or whatever. So I mean, in things like in books about Freemasonry and secret societies, I know there are a lot of symbols that only make sense to someone who knows what they're talking about. But in the grimoires that I've read, they do explain what the symbols are supposed to do.
Okay, cool. James Goldwasser has a great question that I actually wanted to ask. Have you tried in any of the spells?
If I had a dollar for every time someone asked me that, no, I haven't, and I have nothing against practitioners of the art. I think that in order to do my job in the sort of clinical way that I need to not also partake of the occult. Um, I do know people who have said that they have done some of the spells in these books and that they've worked for them. And
Really?
there's nothing. Yes, absolutely. Oh, you meet some very interesting people when this is the kind of book that you
Yeah,
sell.
so put together a rare book show and this topic, and I just can imagine the great conversations. Fuchsia has a question. She says, great talk, Kiley. I'm really struck by the possible visual influence of these 19th century French grimoires on the fin de siècle occult art movement, especially artist books. I'm thinking Orazi's Calendar, Magique,
Mhm.
and Fuchsian ropes, etc. Can you speak at all to this?
Yeah, and it's funny because the the fin de siècle artistic movement is French. when we're looking at like Felician ropes. And it's just, I think it's evidence that France was a place where you could go and express yourself and be witchy or spiritualist, and you would find others that were like you, even if it wasn't widely accepted. But there are books from this period, for instance, Jules Michelet's Les Sorcières is it was, I think the first edition was 1901, but it's a history of witchcraft with the most sumptuous illustration. You know, I'm gonna grab, I have a copy and I'm gonna grab it.
Thank you so much. That's it's always great to have some visuals in the mix.
So this is a history of witchcraft, but the illustrations, I mean, they are very risque, I'll say that, but they're also just absolutely beautiful. And I mean, it almost, the first time I saw this book, I thought the ink was wet. That's how fresh they look.
Wow.
So yeah, I think, Fuchsia, that's a really interesting point, that there's a lot of interplay with occult literary tradition and the occult art of the time.
I've got one more question here. Lawrence Hammer, a question and a thank you so much. Fascinating. I remember in grad school in the mid 1980s, my girlfriend reading Jean Favreau Sade's fabulous ethnography of witchcraft and sorcery, beliefs in the bocage. And I eventually read the English translation. My fieldwork in Papua New Guinea centers on disease causation and religion and sorcery beliefs. So my first question is whether or not you have found greater intensity of witchcraft beliefs in France as opposed to, say, Germany or Italy. Second, did such grimoires, which come from the old German Grimoire book, compendium completion, make new believers or intensity existing beliefs? I'm thinking of her Death at Your Heels, when ethnographic writing propagates the force of witchcraft. Thank you again. Do you need that, the first and second again, or you got it?
Oh, this one. Sorry, I thought someone was speaking. Okay, so first, I do see a lot more of an embrace of witchcraft in the occult in France. In Germany, it's really the history of witchcraft in Germany is super fascinating, because this is actually what I did my master's thesis on. In the early 15th century, you have the Council of Basel, which pretty soon after the Council of Basel is when you start seeing anti-witchcraft publications like the Malleus Maleficarum, and the first edition of Malleus Maleficarum is German. So Germany had sort of a big fatwa on the occult, and starting pretty early in the Renaissance era, they were very broadly denouncing the occult, and they had a lot of authorities that were after witches. So that's not a place that witchcraft would be safe or practitioners of witchcraft would be safe. And in Italy, I think Italy, you don't see that kind of occult fervor because you have Rome and the Vatican right there. And with it being broken up into city-states, there's a lot more governmental reach and a lot more oversight into community activities. So I think France was sort of interestingly positioned to accept practitioners, believers, whereas its neighbors had different avenues. And there was a second question.
The second was here it is. Did such grimoires
make new believers? I mean, you got to think that they did, because why else would they keep being printed? Like, if people weren't being influenced or weren't embracing what the text said, then there would be no market for it.
Right. Lawrence also mentioned, since the publication in 1977 of her book on witchcraft in the bocage of Western France, the author has received numerous requests to help de-witch people who they said were ensconced by having read her book. Wow. So like, yeah, I just noticed that there's a new Exorcist movie out, by the way. Did you see that?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that you got to think that the people that all of these grimoires are being published anonymously because they didn't want to be they didn't want there to be someone to pin the problem on. And I have seen that in court documents of the era where, you know, my 14-year-old daughter read this book and all of a sudden she started sacrificing cats in our barn. You know, I think there wasn't a belief that reading texts could brainwash you, which is it's a valid concern, I think.
Sure, absolutely. Wow, that was really interesting. I'm hooked, and I'm gonna have to look for more of this. Of course, I'm thinking of, you know, my kids reading Harry Potter, and I would go to my cabinet and find all my shampoos and everything made into potions. So the young folk are still very interested in all this, and
yeah, that's it. I love the destigmatization of handling this material that Harry Potter has caused.
That's great. Actually, that is a really, yeah, because the whole spell thing became kind of a fun thing and a, you know, not so deep, dark magic. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Kiley. This was fantastic. I don't think we have any more questions. Great. Thank you for joining us on our brown bag lunch. It was really great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Hope everyone
Thanks, everybody,
has
for coming.
Great week.
And if anybody has any ideas for upcoming brown bag lunches, please get in touch with us at the ABAA headquarters, because we're always looking for interesting things to talk about, whether it's an idea about book selling or about books, or, you know, something to do with what we do. It's a really fun way to get everybody together and to get different folks' ideas. So thank you. And we'll see you all soon at some book fair.